Hi, team. Could you hear me, Matt?
I can hear you great.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for joining all people that knew the first endpoint management linking group summit. Well, I'm very excited to know in this occasion, Matt. Hello there. Welcome to the first ever summit organized by the Modern Endpoint Management Linking Group. Um, Sometimes the simple things mean the most, right? And in that way, just be behind a member to our group by participating in active conversation within the group, by posting content, by posting queries to answering posted queries, and everything that you all do. Correct? Every day you all have helped make this group to become what it is today. And for that, we all, the modern endpoint management, will ever be so grateful to you all. For the current time slot in this first endpoint management summit, we are running the three sessions in the same time. The first time is how to transition GPOs to Intune configuration profiles in room one. And the second is security management with Microsoft Endpoint Management in room two. And the number three is OS the Cloud Windows 11 Autopilot Ready Zero infrastructure in room three. You have currently joined to the session in room two, where Matt Cal, PM in Endpoint Manager in Security, will be delivering a session to the security management with Microsoft Endpoint Manager. During this session, if you have any queries or would you like to a speaker to answer to your question, please post your question in the chat. We will try to get them answered and then of the session during the dedicated Q&A part. Finally, this session will be recorded. As such, if you do not consent to be behind in the recorded session, you are free to leave. And with that, let's welcome Matt. The stage is all yours. Welcome, Matt.
Thanks, Octavio. Appreciate the introduction. So I'm excited to be here and talk to you all a little bit today about security management with Endpoint Manager. Just so you're all aware, well, actually, I should probably do a brief introduction of myself first. My name is Matt Hall. As Octavio said, I'm a PM on the policy and security team. And our team is responsible for all of the great policy stuff that you see in Endpoint Manager, greatest hits like the settings catalog and device configuration, as well as endpoint security. So the Endpoint Security Blade and our integrations with endpoint security products, group policy analytics, as well as solutions like mobile threat defense. So we are the security and policy team. And that's sort of our gambit. What we're going to talk about today, or what we're going to go through today, or what I guess expect to talk about today, is going to be a few things. First, I'm going to frame the Microsoft Endpoint Manager security management story for you all, level set how we think about security management internally, how we think about it in terms of the policy team, and you know, the sort of the steps that we take to build the solutions that you see in the console today. I'm going to talk a little bit about endpoint security changes that just went live on Tuesday. So you'll see some new things in the Endpoint Security Blade. I'm going to talk about those real quickly. More importantly, I'm going to talk about the why we did them, to sort of give you some inside baseball on why we make the decisions we made to sort of migrate these experiences. And then I'm going to talk about security management for Microsoft Defender for Endpoint. We have a solution that we use, or that we talk about internally, that allows devices that are only onboarded to Microsoft Defender for Endpoint to check in and receive policy from Endpoint Manager. So we'll talk about that, and then I'll take any questions, comments, concerns that the group has. So hopefully this is a pretty good agenda for you all. I hope to leave probably about 10 minutes at the end for questions, 10 or 15 minutes. I will need to leave right at the top of the hour, so I'm gonna try and leave enough time so I can answer some questions there, and Octavio will get any that I need to follow up on, and should be good to go there. So without further ado, let's get into it here. So unified security management, sort of how do we think about it? From the Microsoft perspective, this notion of unified endpoint security isn't necessarily new. It's something that we strive for or have strived for in the enterprise space for quite some time. Microsoft's uniquely positioned to sort of advocate for unified endpoint security because of the sort of breadth of our stack. Together, Microsoft Endpoint Manager, Defender for Endpoint, and Azure Active Directory are pretty well positioned to provide a seamless integrated experience that looks and feels sort of the same across products, as well as allows you to leverage sort of investments you make in one or the other. On top of that, we have some principles that we use here at Microsoft every day when we build software, when we build customer experiences. The big things for us, and these should resonate with the customers that are on the phone, right? So we want to be secure by default coming out of the box. We want to be, we realize that Windows is an open platform. We realize that Windows enables organizations to configure and use Windows the way they need to for their business. We want to make sure that out of the box, it's as secure as possible. We want to make sure that those built-in features that come secure out of the box are manageable. We want to make sure that they don't disrupt business practice, and we want to get better. Like, we just want security to be a no-brainer across the board. And that's from our Windows features all the way up to the management aspects or the management pieces of our infrastructure. We also want to make sure that, Windows isn't the most important platform in the world for all organizations, right? We have an extensive cross-platform story that we're expanding, every day. So Mac OS management, security features for Mac OS like Defender for Endpoint, right? Seamless integrations on Mac OS like the Azure AD, the Azure Active Directory single sign-on extension, right? So the platform that you pick sort of is orthogonal to the experience that your enterprise manages, right? And we're making advancements there every day and adding additional platform support. So in this session, I'll talk a little bit about how we're going to add some additional Linux capability to our Defender for Endpoint sometime in the future, right? So for us, we know enterprises have a diverse set of platforms. We know enterprises have a diverse set of users using those platforms in terms of the scenarios and all the different methods and access patterns, right? And we want to make sure that we support not just the Microsoft ecosystem and the Microsoft platforms, but we want to make sure that we sort of support all of those platforms in a single surface, no pun intended, for management and control planes. And then we want to use analytics to make sure that our users are happy, right? That's the sort of the backside of this. So, in the MEM suite, we have the endpoint analytics and the MEM analytics sort of constructs where we're making new strides every day on the way that we correlate signals coming from devices, not just signals, telemetry that you'd expect, but signals that help customers sort of identify what's going on that device, right? And, if the end user is having a great experience. So for us, when we think about security, all of these sort of things come into play, right? The user experience, the platform and the performance on that platform that you're using it on, and then the protections that we provide out of the box to make sure that those are great, right? But when we drill down a little bit further and we think about endpoint security management, that historically covers sort of two areas: a set of settings, right? And then a set of sort of scenarios or experiences, right? So on the top, these are things that customers think about all the time. They think about antivirus, disk encryption, firewall. These things are, analogous with security policy and security management. There's some newer areas that we've advanced over time, or not we being the industry has advanced over time. Advanced attack surface sort of reduction techniques, right? And attack surface mitigation techniques. Advanced sort of endpoint detection and response capability. These are, this is a whole industry around, taking events, correlating them to actions and behaviors, and then taking action on those behaviors and sort of events that are happening on the endpoint. And then further strengthening the identity layer with multi-factor authentication, as well as all the strong auth credentials like FIDO keys and Windows Hello for Business that is pretty much what every organization is thinking about right now, even more so now in a hybrid world. So that's really important. So when we think about when we say the term security management, or we say endpoint security management, we're typically talking about that top sort of tier that's on the slide right now, is that sort of set of controls that all relate to these items. Now, like in the settings catalog, for instance, we have 11,000 some settings, right, that are available today. Not all of those settings fit into the endpoint security or the security management category, right? Some are experience-based, some are app control-based, right? Like different control of different app experiences, that sort of stuff. So when we say security management, this is what we're really talking about. And then when we take those items above and we start building on things like endpoint detection and response, or EDR, as we call it in the industry, is we start getting things like security integrations and tasks, and we get tools start working together. Things like conditional access to take signals from MEM based on, you know, what is happening on the device or what state the device is in sort of revoking status on the identity plane to resources and that sort of thing. So, you know, on the top layer, you have sort of like the raw controls, and then the bottom layer here, we have sort of the scenarios that we can build on top of those controls to help build these rich sort of experiences that the enterprises sort of long for, to make sure they're doing more with less, right? Because everybody has to do more with less nowadays, it seems like. With all that in mind, sort of the thing that organizations need, and the thing that we're sort of going after with our unified endpoint security management, is a scenario where I see all my platforms in a single pane. I know, like, it makes sense when I look at the policy and controls, and they're grouped and deployed in such a way that match my business needs in terms of how I target and how I deploy. But on top of it being easy to deploy, and on top of it being sort of grouped in a fashion that makes sense to me, I also need the granularity, right? This is the reason the settings catalog exists, because there was a need not just for policies that are supported via, you know, the MDM, the mobile device management stack, so on and so forth. Like, we needed to expand that to make anybody moving from group policy to MDM, make that a reality for them, right? It's not that you should move every control from GPO to MDM, but there's controls that are needed by business that are GPO only. And our team, specifically Mr. Donosky on our team, has been working really hard to make sure that the controls that need to be in place to make GPO migration successful are there. And then Asavri, one of my peers on my team, has been working on that group policy analytics tooling, which allows you to sort of take your on-prem sort of GPOs and do that mapping, right? Do that mapping to see, what do I need? What don't I need? What do I need to consider? Where do I need to focus my efforts? Her and the team have been like working on that for what seems like forever, because that tooling is just so complex to do that mapping, and the work we need to do with feature teams to make sure that, you know, this Windows component team or that Windows component team has the correct sort of knobs and controls for these migration scenarios has just been a monumental level of effort. And then on top of all of those things with settings and controls, organizations tell us, hey, it's great that you allow us to configure, but what we need to do is we need to be able to assess that state, right? So you'll see, you know, we have things like the device health attestation service and other attestation sort of areas in compliance, where we're starting to look at signals, not just from the device, but from other areas, right? To help us determine, is that device healthy? Is that device in a state that I can trust it? And our device risk scenarios with Microsoft Defender for Endpoint, or any of our mobile threat defense partners, are a perfect example of this, right? So in those scenarios, we're able to attach or connect those toolings directly together. So whether it's a mobile threat defense vendor or a vendor like Microsoft Defender for Endpoint internally, they can feed signals based on what they see in telemetry in their respective toolings to provide advanced compliance scenarios to revoke access to resources when things just get out of hand. So that's what customers sort of tell us they need. They need these advanced integrations. They need these granular controls to help them migrate, because we have 30 years of controls on-prem that we need to sort of rationalize, and there's business reasons why we need all of them. And then, you know, make everything simple. First and foremost, though, everything that we do should be seamless and frictionless, right? Like, we shouldn't need to click 10,000 buttons to set things up. We shouldn't need to go to 17,000 places to do things. So for us, although it may not always seem like it, we want to make sure that it's seamless and frictionless, and it's a journey, right? Microsoft is as big as most organizations are complex, And we're working together as one unit to make sure that we're building and moving towards this North Star of a seamless integrated scenario for security management, as well as the rest of the M365 integration plane, right? So that's important. If we drill down into security management and how we make this real, sort of the next step is breaking down sort of this historical silo, right? Anybody who's been in IT knows, or anybody who's been in security knows. Security teams and IT teams typically have a tumultuous relationship. They typically are operating in two separate silos, trying to accomplish their goals. And the goals are, well, working for the same organization are very different. Security teams in general are there to mitigate risk. The most secure machine is a machine that is in a tight blue screen loop for every 2 seconds, right? It never turns on, therefore it can't be compromised. But we all know that that is not a productive machine, right? So security and IT have different charters. Security, managing that risk that comes from having a machine on the network, comes from having the machine sort of exposed at different attack surfaces, right? And that's their role inside of most organizations. And that's what drives sort of how they think and how they deliver. On IT's side of the house, they have a management and compliance aspect, but the other thing that they deal more directly with are end users. So end users are asking, and they're sort of opening tickets, and they're everybody who's in end using computing on this phone knows that end users get mad when they can't do stuff, and they usually can't do stuff because of security, right? So it sort of builds this sort of natural, I'll call it rivalry between teams, where these teams don't typically work together, or when they do work together, they're on a very small set of things, and they still have their own, monolithic tooling that they use to manage devices and configure devices. And where that actually comes down, or where that joins, those two teams typically join, are in two areas. They're typically in the C-suite, where maybe both teams roll up to one individual. The individual might be the CEO, right, or the chief executive officer. And the other place they typically meet is on the endpoint, right? Well, we can handle, disputes in the boardroom, but disputes on the endpoint typically cause huge business impact and huge business friction. So for Microsoft, we've worked tightly with our counterparts on the Defender team, both the Defender platform side and the Defender for Endpoint side for EDR, to make sure that we're building comprehensive controls and experiences that don't require an orthogonal management plane. And that's where the endpoint security node comes into place. So we talk a lot about, there's the endpoint security blade, and then there's the device configuration blade, and what's the difference, right? Let's first, before I jump into the difference and when you should use what where, let's first talk about endpoint security and what its goal is as a surface, right? Its goal is to have workload-driven settings management. That's really what we're after here, right? So workload settings management is important because without workload settings management, security admins are in the sea of management. And when you're in the sea of management, there's 11,000 rocks floating around that are management knobs. And those can be overwhelming, they can increase complexity, and they can increase error rate or prone to error rate, right? When we start configuring settings or managing settings. So endpoint security is meant to be a place where we can delegate access to admins that are configuring those traditional workloads that we talked about at the beginning of the session, the antivirus, the disk encryption, the firewall, et cetera. But they're coming through the same management plane. So remember, before those settings, those sort of teams were meeting at the endpoint and at the C-suite. Now they're meeting at the MEM service, right? So the MEM service is able to basically distribute one set of policy from both teams down, which is important. It's also important when we get to troubleshooting scenarios and identifying what's going on in your environment, because when we use the endpoint security blade to configure policies, security admin policy, we all of a sudden get visibility for sec admins, and we get visibility for IT pros, management pros, on what's actually going to the device. And that is important. Anybody who's ever worked with a third-party management tool knows, or a different management tool from your security tooling knows, that When the tools are completely in silos, you can spend hours or weeks just trying to figure out what's putting a setting where. And when we combine those two on the management layer, which is the Microsoft sort of position in vision, we start to like bring that visibility across tools into one space. And our customers who use the tooling in this fashion tell us, hey, it's great that I can go into a device, I can look at all the configuration profiles that are there. And if I see one that I don't recognize, like antivirus, I'm able to go in, see who created it, and understand what settings are entailed there. So it cuts my troubleshooting time down significantly. So that's important. That's important for a whole ton of reasons. But the big thing here is giving that visibility between the two silos. But in creating this visibility and reducing the noise for security admins, we recognize that what we've done over time is sort of created like almost the problem in our own console. Like we have the endpoint security blade and the device config blade, and we're making changes to bring them together and on the same pane. So I talked about on Tuesday that we rolled out a set of changes. Those are live now in all environments. So you can go ahead and look at these right now in your Intune console or your endpoint security console if you'd like to. The big things that I want you to know that we're going to be changing in the endpoint security blade and policy management as a whole over the next 6 to 12 months is we're going to create policy creation flows, standard policy naming, standard options across the board. You see this today with the first set of profiles that we've migrated in endpoint security. I'll get to that in a second. But the big thing for us is we want you to go to endpoint security. We want you to go to the device config. We want you to configure policy where it's comfortable for you and where it's correct for your persona. And we want to make sure everything looks the same. So policy creation flows, they need to support configuring a standard policy set of knobs across all the different planes. And we're doing that. I want a world where people who have different roles in the organization have the ability to configure certain sets of policies and scenarios. So we'll be working towards a future where we have more granular RBAC in the policy and endpoint security space to allow customers to say, things like, hey, this is antivirus policy. This is managed by my antivirus admins. I only want antivirus admins to be able to configure antivirus policy. We're a long way away today from that, but we're making incremental improvements to build that sort of complex RBAC, not just for endpoint security, but for policy space in general. So we're looking at that. And then, my friend and colleague, Mike Donosky, in the entire device configuration team, built this wonderful thing called the settings catalog, which is a sheer engineering miracle. It's a feat of awesomeness. And that settings catalog houses every single setting, with the exception of maybe like a handful that are available in Windows, right? There's around 11,000 settings that are in that catalog today, I believe. And we want to, everything we do, we want to be backed by that catalog, because the aspirations that we have above, the catalog is what the foundation is for all of that. It's what baselines and supercharges that whole process. Once we get to a catalog model where we have sort of this maintenance of settings and this maintenance of strings and options and UI elements and all that sort of stuff, now with that standardization, we can start to drive these advanced experiences that we know our enterprises want, right? So a world backed by settings catalog is sort of where we're going with that. So on Tuesday, we released the first set of profiles that'll be converted, or that are converted now. We're in what we would call a side-by-side experience mode, where policies that you've created before Tuesday will continue to look and feel like the policies that you've seen, right? Policies created after Tuesday will all be backed by the settings catalog and get all the reporting and targeting and improvements that the settings catalog profiles sort of bring to the table, right? These are the first set of profiles, and this is an example of what it looks like, right? So I have up here probably one of the biggest functionality changes for us is, the endpoint detection response profile differences. So on the top here, you'll see this is the old profile. I have the Defender for Endpoint Connector enabled, which hides the onboarding setting. It just assumes that, when I'm deploying the policy that, I want to onboard, and I'll get that blob or that onboarding package directly from Defender for Endpoint at policy creation time. And that was a great model for 2 or 3 years ago. What we've come to find from customers is there's a lot of complex scenarios as Defender for Endpoint market share grows, and as Defender for Endpoint becomes sort of a solution for almost every enterprise. We have the need to handle these things called like merger acquisition scenarios and tenant migrations and all that sort of stuff. So the one thing that's missing from there is I can't manually specify a blob, nor do I have any sort of visual representation of, hey, what's going on here? Like, what's the deal? So in the bottom pane, you'll see the new settings catalog back profile. It looks almost the same. The UI elements are a little bit different than they were in the existing profiles. But the big thing that you'll see on the top is that there's a drop down. Now, if you've already created a policy, we won't allow you to change the sort of intent for onboarding for that policy for a host of reasons, including accidental offboarding of your entire fleet if you choose the wrong option. But that drop down now, when you go to create a policy, we'll have 2 options, onboard and offboard. You'll be able to manually specify a blob or an onboarding package from Defender for Endpoint. You can go see this today in your console. If you have the connector enabled, the integration between Microsoft Defender for Endpoint and Microsoft Endpoint Manager will now show an automatic or an auto from connector setting, right? Which allows you to say, hey, when I don't want to specify a blob manually, I want to automatically grab the onboarding blob, because those are the scenarios that we support for automatic integration. I want to automatically bring that blob from MDE like I do today in the policy that's above. So this is just one of the benefits of being able to go to the new device configuration platform that Settings Catalog is built on. In addition to all the reporting enhancements that Laura Ariza, who's another peer of mine, who for the last 3 months feels like she's lived and breathed reporting, probably the last year actually, has done a ton of work to make sure our reporting experiences get better and also become clearer for customers. And she's published a few blogs. I encourage you to check those out. All of these new profiles leverage all of those enhancements in reporting, which is a big deal. The other thing that I'll call out with this change in profiles is we republished the attack surface reduction rules profile. In that profile today, right now, is the block vulnerable drivers rule that so many people are trying to deploy. MEM has tried to support it for quite some time. It has been added to the new profile. It's there today. You can go configure the block vulnerable driver rule right next to all of the other attack surface reduction rules in endpoint security. The other thing that this gives us is, remember I said that we, in settings catalog is all these settings. We automatically ingest those settings for Windows and have a defined schema for cross-platform. So this allows us to be more agile. We don't have to do any more long development work to add new settings. Now what will happen is, as soon as Windows publishes a setting, we can ingest that, validate it, and deploy it. So what used to take us 1 to 3 months, maybe 6 months, depending on how complicated the setting was, typically is going to take us about a month now, if not closer to release, right? If we can get ahead of the release cycle, which we try to, but with so many feature teams and so many different areas, it can be hard. And that's not an excuse, it's just reality. But we're going to move closer to that day 0 support than we have ever been able to get in the past. So that's really important. Okay, so now I've told you, hey, I changed all these profiles on you. Like, what can you expect from these new profiles, right? So the docs are all updated. The doc updates went live yesterday morning, I believe, maybe Tuesday night before. The docs are updated. They are all there. Go take a look, go read through them. There's nothing monumental changing in the documents. What we've done is we've started mapping sort of the new UX options and the new options for configuration back to old options in the docs. So that way it's clear to you what does what when. People frequently call me out on Twitter. I encourage you to do the same when you see something that doesn't look right, and I'll get it fixed. I recently just fixed probably 40 lines of docs for somebody on Twitter yesterday. It's something we try and keep up with, but we're not perfect. Mistakes happen, and we want to do our best to fix them as quickly as possible. Those, like I said before, while we're in side-by-side mode, those existing policies that you've already created and already deployed, there's no changes to them. They'll continue to be editable. They'll continue to be deployed. That's fine. At some point in the future, we're going to migrate all of those old policies to the new platform. Our team is working hard engineering that right now. The number of policies in Endpoint Manager would astound you. Just the number we create a day would astound you. So there's going to be a lot of engineering effort going behind making sure that we build the right migration path to this new platform and this new foundation. In the meantime, any new policies you create will be created with this the settings catalog back experience, which you'll all see in the console today if you go there and look. And then last thing that I'll sort of say about this is co-management in the past has been mapped to the endpoint protection profile type. And so you've been sort of limited to what's available in the endpoint protection device configuration template, right? With this sort of migration, we will be including everything that's in the endpoint security blade today in co-management. So this was already the case for 80% of what's in endpoint security. However, some of the settings in endpoint security weren't available in that endpoint protection silo, that template, right? So it created an experience that could have unintended effects when you were deploying some endpoint security policies, like maybe 3, and it would show some settings as not applicable. Today, the story is going to get a lot simpler. If endpoint security, if you move the endpoint protection workload in co-management, anything in endpoint security, once all the setting profiles are migrated, or anything in that endpoint protection profile will apply, and it'll be awesome. So that'll be great. So where are we going from here? We're going to convert the rest of the profiles. We have, I think, 6 left. I think there's 6 left for us to complete. Those have some work that needed to be done in the settings that are contained therein. However, we felt like there was so much value here, we couldn't hold back these new profiles that are all ready to go. So we decided to release them out of band. And over the next few months, you'll see us migrate the remainder of the profiles over. Then we will tackle the policy aspect. And we're looking at doing that sometime in the future. I don't have a timeline for you today. As soon as we feel like the quality is there and the engineering effort is complete, we'll start migrating. We'll start a migration process, which will be highly communicated and highly visible to everybody. So don't worry about it. You're not going to miss it. So that'll be great. And then we want to further refine sort of our template experience and what that looks like, right? So that's important. That's endpoint security. That's sort of where we are today, how we think about it, the advancements that we made, and sort of where we plan on going in the future. So yeah, hopefully that was useful. I don't know if I have any questions in the chat or any comments or anything that we want to talk about on that before I switch gears here and talk about security management for Defender for Endpoint. Octavio, anything from you as chief moderator and friend?
No, Matt, for the moment, all is okay. I'm monitoring the questions, but no, okay. All is okay for the moment.
Awesome. Great. So let's talk about security management for Microsoft Defender for Endpoint. Okay. Microsoft Defender for Endpoint and Endpoint Manager have a really deep relationship. Just for instance, the team in our Defender org that owns the management of the Defender clients and I and my team work together as sort of one big virtual team, right? So we really tackle this story not as 2 teams that are building their own things in their own place, but really we build it as one big virtual team and family, right? So when we start thinking about I guess, where we collaborate and what we work on, right? So there's sort of four areas, right? There's the endpoint detection response components. There's a threat and vulnerability management components, which are really defender owned scenarios. And those are, the core to the defender value proposition, right? The defender for endpoint value proposition, right? So those are key there. Where we overlap are going to be in these sort of middle scenarios, right? Let's see if I can. Oh man, look at these building out. Let's see here. Where we really overlap are these middle scenarios, right? These middle scenarios are attack surface reduction and next-gen protection. So those profiles, settings, things that you saw in the Endpoint Security Blade, how we apply those and how we manage those settings. Those things around attack surface reduction, like the things that we do with ASR rules and device control, those scenarios that we build there together, are really where the core of our business is together. This is where we operate as one big virtual team. We have integrations with security tasks and threat and vulnerability management. And we have integrations like you just saw with the endpoint detection response profile to ease the onboarding process, right? But when we start looking at the core day-to-day management functionality, security management functionality, so those AV profiles, those BitLocker profiles, those firewall profiles, right? Where we really sort of spend a lot of time and work together to make sure the management experience makes sense. So today at Intune or an Endpoint Manager, you have essentially two different prongs, if you will, right? On the left-hand side, well, you have three, but I'm going to talk about them like where before we release this feature. So in the beginning, there was two, right? These two scenarios are Endpoint Manager in the cloud and Configuration Manager on-prem. And we have this thing called the Endpoint Security Console, which ties these two together, which means if I want to deploy AV policy to devices in Configuration Manager and devices in Intune, I can do that in the same surface, right? So that way I'm configuring my security management policy, and by the magics of Cloud Attach, which if you're an on-prem customer using Configuration Manager and you haven't used Cloud Attach, you should really think about how you start cloud powering your config man infrastructure, right? We can deploy sort of these Intune, these Endpoint Manager profiles down through Configuration Manager to your client devices without the clients ever being enrolled into Intune or into Endpoint Manager. So for those clients that don't have line of sight to the cloud, or those clients that can't get a join, can't be hybrid join for whatever reason, or Azure AD join, this scenario, this tenant attached scenario allows you to sort of, deploy policy to these devices through the investment you already have in on-prem Configuration Manager today. And of course, we support Intune through all of this, right? But the value add for tenant attach or tenant attach support is, we're getting to the point where we have, I think, 9 of 16 profiles that are either entering preview or already in preview. We have 3 or 4 that are GA. We just GA'd antivirus and endpoint detection response last sprint. But our goal is to get to a full portfolio of security management controls. So you don't have to pick, how I manage things. And we need that agility with the cloud as we add new settings to not need to upgrade Configuration Manager every single time we need to introduce a new setting. That seems like a heavy workload, right? Easy as Configuration Manager upgrades are. We want to make sure that we service clients that have no connection to the cloud or can't have a connection to the cloud with that same security policy and value that you see in the Endpoint Security Console. And then in addition, we want to leverage that Configuration Manager targeting infrastructure that customers have spent a large amount of time building, right? These things, they're called collections. They're super flexible. So in this scenario, we allow you to target security policy from Intune to collections on-prem, which is incredible, right? But that wasn't enough. What we were told from customers was like, hey, great, you got my Intune devices, you got my MEM devices, you got my Configuration Manager devices, that's great, but I still have a set of devices that don't go into either, right? They don't go into, I don't allow them to talk to Configuration Manager because they're in a demilitarized zone, right? Or a DMZ, or, they have unfettered access to the internet, right? They're in a trust boundary that Configuration Manager isn't in, right? Or I have devices that are short-lived, right? That sort of run through crazy work cycles, or they are born in the cloud, or they're born outside of my organization, and I have a provisioning process to onboard them to my security tooling, but I don't want to stand up additional infrastructure or do the management aspects because the devices just aren't alive for that long, or they're just outside of my normal scope of management. So that's where the security management for Microsoft Defender for Endpoint comes in. Again, we want to build a full suite of security controls. Policy is authored right inside of the Endpoint Security Blade, alongside Configuration Manager policy. It's the same policy. So if you look at all those changes that we just shipped on Tuesday, you'll notice that some of the profiles have the and Windows Server, the long sentence as a platform type. That and Windows Server sort of indicates that these profiles apply to security management for Microsoft Defender for Endpoint devices as well, right? And I'll get to why in a second. And then, the big thing with this scenario is outside of, the full policy support and authoring experience, and then the full control support would be the Defender for Endpoint client is what will check in to Endpoint Manager and enforce policy. So the device itself will not be enrolled into Endpoint Manager, but the Defender for Endpoint client on the device, known as Sense will be enrolled into Endpoint Manager and be able to pull configuration policy. So back to my friendly spider chart. So this is what this really looks like today, right? So now with the additional Defender for Endpoint scenarios, this is what it looks like today. So we have Configuration Manager now moved over to the middle. And now with Defender for Endpoint, we support Server 2012 R2, Windows 10 and later in this sort of setup. We have plans to support Linux and Mac OS through the Defender for Endpoint channel as well. So if those devices are onboarded to endpoint to Defender for Endpoint, they will be able to do the same thing that Windows 10 and Windows Server can do in terms of retrieving and applying security settings. So that's important. So this is how we sort of envision this whole thing, is like Endpoint Manager is the hub. And then when you want to deploy security management policy, you're just getting the devices into that hub, right? So we want you to leverage the existing infrastructure where you already have it in place, because there's no reason to stand up something new when you already have something in place that will work. But where that infrastructure isn't in place and you're deploying the Defender for Endpoint, either P1 or P2 client, you'll be able to leverage this new scenario, or Defender for Server, right? Depending on how you're licensed for Defender. So what is required to accommodate this scenario? So Microsoft Defender for Endpoint, Azure Active Directory. We need devices that are the proper patch level. Keep going back here. Let's see if I can not screw up the pane. One more. Okay. We need devices that are the proper patch level and client. So what that means is in our documentation, which are hot linked at the bottom here, aka.ms/security management, there's a cumulative rollup that's needed on Windows Server 2019 and later, and Windows 10 and later, in order to enable this scenario. Everybody on this call hopefully already has that installed, because I believe it is the November 2021 security rollup. So if you're not patched from November 2021, we should probably have a larger conversation about how you manage patch compliance. But yeah, so if you have that installed, you're already good to go. On Server 2012 R2 and Server 2016, there's a Defender for down level client, which is linked in the docs. That is capable of this scenario, right? It's that client is essentially a replacement for the old Microsoft monitoring agent security story on those down level operating systems. And then optionally, you'll need to have hybrid join configured if the devices are joined to Active Directory, right? So in this part of the scenario, we will create a trust with the directory, and then we will and then after we create that trust, we use that to communicate with MEM, right? So let's talk a little bit about how this whole thing works, right? So this will be, I didn't set up any demos for this, but this is fine. The slides are incredible, if I do say so myself. So we have three sort of components. We have Defender for Endpoint, we have Microsoft Endpoint Manager and Azure Active Directory. And on the bottom, we have a device that is onboarded to MDE, right? So step one, remember this scenario is intended for scenarios where you don't have Endpoint Manager in place already. Otherwise, you just distribute the policy over those scenarios, right? Or over those sort of planes. So you onboard the device to MDE using whatever method is available to you. Now, whether that's a script that you have to run manually, whether that's another management tool, whether that's a provisioning process, whatever it might be, you onboard the device to Microsoft Defender for Endpoint. Once the device is onboarded, the device looks to see if it has an existing Azure Active Directory trust. If it doesn't have an Azure Active Directory trust, either an Azure AD join or a hybrid Azure Active Directory trust, known as a global device join, then it will create one seamlessly with no user interaction, right? So for Active Directory join devices, it will initiate the OS hybrid join process, which means that the device must be in scope for hybrid join. And unless you've taken changes to modify your configuration for Azure Active Directory Connect, as long as you've configured hybrid join in your environment, most, if not all devices should fall in scope. The exception to this is for Server 2012 R2 devices. We are introducing with this solution, the Azure Active Directory team is introducing with this solution, the ability to hybrid join a Server 2012 R2 box, which was previously not possible. So if you are going to support Server 2012 R2 devices in the hybrid join scenario, we have in our docs, aka.ms/security management, we have a rule modification to the Azure AD Connect rule to make sure that Server 2012 R2 devices aren't excluded. Once, if it's Azure AD join, if it's workgroup or Azure AD join, the device will just use that Azure AD join or create an Azure AD join that's limited to just the functions needed for MDE, right? So things like logging in with any account in the directory shouldn't be possible. If you have any questions about that, please reach out to our team and we're happy to walk you through sort of the capabilities there. They're also docked. So once I'm joined to Azure Active Directory, this starts to look more and more like a normal endpoint manager scenario. The Sense client or the Defender for Endpoint client on the device will enroll into Endpoint Manager, and then it will start to receive policies, right? These are the same policies that you configure for your MDM devices today. These are devices that, these are policies that have that, comma server, Windows 10, Windows 11, comma server. So those new settings cataloged back policies will come down to the device. And then they're enforced by the Defender for Endpoint client that's present. Grouping, targeting, reporting, assignments, everything sort of works the same as normal Endpoint Manager devices. The two exceptions are we only support device-based policy with this scenario. Remember, we haven't talked about a user yet, so everything here is device-based scenario, device-based. And then the second thing is some premium features like compliance, some features like app deployment, that sort of stuff. Assignment filters, for instance, aren't available in the Defender for Endpoint scenario because it's a limited enrollment, right? So our goal here, remember, is to get security management policy to the device. The full Endpoint Manager suite is required if you'd like to do endpoint management tasks, like use our advanced functionality like assignment filters, app deployment, Windows update rings, all that sort of stuff, right? So that's essentially how this works and how this, how this whole scenario executes. The security management decision matrix is pretty simple. It used to be a little bit more complex. When I started here on the team, it's a little bit more complex than this. But after everything I've told you and all the spider charts I've shown you, the first thing is like if I use Endpoint Manager, then I use Intune or Configuration Manager to enforce and transport policy. That's it. If I don't use it on the device or on all my devices, and I use Defender for Endpoint, I can start, using the new security management scenario to bring them into the same surface in Endpoint Manager that I manage all my other devices at. But it's key to note that, in all these scenarios, I'm configuring and managing policy through the Endpoint Security Blade or through the Endpoint Manager console to deploy and manage and report on those things. So, that being said, I wanted to stop 10 minutes before. I am 12 minutes before, so I think that we're good. I think I'm ready to answer some questions if there are any in the group. Octavio, what do we got, man? What do you got? Any questions, comments, concerns from the audience?
Yeah, well, Ralph asked Matt, um, fantastic tools, but customer as owner of tenant is very careful on permission delegation of IT provider. Well, permissions granted a prerequisite. At present, we are missing granularity for customer provide permissions based list privilege. What is the roadmap on this?
It is not lost on us for multi-tenant scenarios and that sort of stuff. So we have a great, there's a great MSP sort of story. If you're in a service provider scenario story, I can dig up the guidance on that and how you do that sort of management for Endpoint Manager. All the solutions that we talked about here today all follow the RBAC constructs and the scoping constructs that exist in Intune today. It's good feedback. We want to enable customers to work however they need to work with their customer bases. And we also want to make sure that we're as secure as possible and not over delegating privileges. So I don't have any specific roadmap items to share with you. I can just tell you that I've received that feedback specifically in our security management scenarios, and it's something that's top of mind for us.
Excellent. And one more questions from Mark is for firewalls configuration in MEM. What is the best way to remove a rule from a device?
Best way to remove a rule from a device. It depends on how the rule got to the device. We do tattoo removal through our firewall configurations in MEM today. Meaning, if you deploy a firewall rule to a device and then you consequently remove that rule, we will remove the firewall rule as well. Where it becomes a little tricky is when rules are added manually to a device. There's a firewall setting that I would encourage you to investigate called local rule merge. That will remove or sort of orphan all of the rules that are defined locally on a device. So the scenario there would be you define local rule merge equals false or whatever the setting nomenclature is, and then you would deploy your approved rules down to the device through the management plane. Whether that's MEM or tenant attached policy, which I believe we'll probably release in the next 2 months, or it's GPO. You configure that local management authority or that local management merge policy, and that just tells the firewall components on the device to ignore everything that's there locally. I'm positive that there are scripts in the internet sphere on how to manually remove rules if you know the name of them. The problem with targeting a specific rule is that it doesn't really leave you in a state where you can be sure about the end state of the device, which is why that local merge functionality, setting that to false, gives you sort of the assurance that, hey, the only thing that's active on that device for firewall rules are the rules that I'm pushing from the management plane. So that would be my recommendation there on handling orphaned rules and that sort of stuff. And I'm sure that there's different ways to do it. I'm not by any stretch of the means the only authoritative source on firewall rule management, but I've worked in several large enterprises. So.
Okay, perfect and awesome. We don't have any more questions for the moment. And before to close the session, thank you very much for your time, Matt. It was really an excellent session. And for all the attendees, remember that the recording for our first Endpoint Management Summit will be present. Thank you for all your participation, and Matt, thank you for your time. Okay, enjoy the rest of the session and have a nice day. Matt,
no worries. Thank you. Talk to you all later.
Thank you.